I know from personal experience that family estrangement is one of the most painful and misunderstood experiences a person can go through. For a long time, I felt deeply ashamed of my estrangement from my mother and much of my family. I worried about what it said about me, how others might see me as damaged, as someone who came from a broken family. I lost my sense of belonging, my shared history, and the one place that's supposed to feel safe never truly existed and never would. So if someone in your life is estranged right now, the words you choose matter more than you realise, because even well-meaning kind comments can land like another rejection. As a chartered psychologist, I've spent over a decade working closely with people navigating the distress that comes with family estrangement. I've sat across from hundreds of individuals in the incredibly painful position of being estranged from a parent, a sibling, a child, a cousin, sometimes an entire family. I understand the psychological weight of estrangement professionally, and I understand it personally too, because it's something I've lived. And I know how isolating it can feel. I know how much the wrong words can hurt, even when they're meant with care. For a long time, I found it difficult to talk openly about my own estrangement because so many responses carried judgment, discomfort, or quiet assumptions. And that's one of the cruelest parts of this. It doesn't just hurt in the moment. It can stop people from reaching out for support altogether. And that's why this conversation matters so much. Now, let's get into the real substance of this, because there's a lot to cover and every part of this will matter, whether you're supporting a friend, a partner, a colleague, or someone you care about who has quietly told you they're estranged from their family. First, we need to understand the landscape. Family estrangement is far more common than most people think. The reason you don't hear about it isn't because it's rare, it's because the shame around it is huge. We're raised on powerful messages about family loyalty, that blood is thicker than water, that family is sacred, and that no matter what happens behind closed doors, you stay, you forgive, you keep showing up. So when someone makes the decision to step away, they're not just leaving a relationship, they're stepping into a social minefield where almost everyone has an opinion, a judgment, or some well-meaning advice that they didn't ask for. And here's something really important. People don't usually become estranged on a whim. In most cases, they've spent years, sometimes decades, trying to make things work. They've had conversations, they've set boundaries, they've gone to therapy, they've hoped, they've grieved, they've tried again and again. By the time someone reaches an estrangement, they are often completely exhausted. What they need from you is not a debate. What they need is a witness. So let's talk about one of the most common things people say that they think is supportive, but is actually deeply painful. And here it is, but they're your family. It might come out as family is everything, you only get one mum, at the end of the day they're still your parents, things like this. People say this as if the estranged person has somehow forgotten that biology exists, as if this is new information that will suddenly change everything. But what they actually hear, what the person who's estranged actually hear, is they hear that the family label matters more than what they experience. They hear that their pain is being minimized, and very often they hear that you are not a safe person to talk to about this anymore. I remember people saying to me, you only get one mother, without having any idea about what my situation was. And what happened in that moment wasn't that I reconsidered my decision, it was that I shut down. I learned very quickly who I could and couldn't talk to. If you think about it from a psychological standpoint, this becomes very clear. If someone told you they had ended a friendship because that person had treated them badly for years, you wouldn't say, but they're your friend. You would probably believe them, you would validate them, you might even say, that sounds really hard. The only reason estrangement gets challenged in this way is because family carries a unique cultural weight. Somehow the label family is treated as more important than the behaviour within the relationship. And that can be incredibly damaging for someone who has already fought so hard to protect themselves. So, what can you say instead? One of the most powerful responses is to simply say, this must have been an incredibly difficult decision. That sentence does a lot of emotional work. It acknowledges there was a long process. It doesn't demand justification. It doesn't push for details. It recognises that estrangement comes at a cost. And for many people, that kind of recognition is deeply healing. You could also ask something like, what are your beliefs about family? This is a gentle but meaningful question. It invites the person to share their own framework instead of having yours imposed on them. It shows curiosity rather than judgment, and sometimes the most supportive thing you can say is very simple. You deserve relationships that feel safe and healthy. That's clear, grounding, and affirming. Now, let's move on to another category of unhelpful responses. And this one really kind of gets under my skin professionally because it involves minimising. Minimising often sounds like every family has problems, my family wasn't perfect either, but we still talk. Are you sure it was that bad? People usually say these things because they think they're building connection. They think they're saying, I understand, I've been there too, but what the estranged person often hears is something very different. They hear their experience being scaled down. They hear an unspoken message that says, what you went through isn't that unusual, so why did you take such an extreme step? And this can be especially painful for people whose estrangement is rooted in abuse, neglect, or serious psychological harm. Imagine someone who has lived through years of emotional manipulation or physical violence or being made to feel fundamentally worthless. And then they hear, well, nobody's perfect, maybe cut them some slack. That can be genuinely re-traumatizing because it echoes the same dismissal they have experienced inside the family itself. It reinforces the idea that their pain isn't serious enough to justify protecting themselves, and that message can land very heavily. For me, comments like that didn't make me feel understood. They made me feel like I had to defend my own reality. There's also another kind of response that can be incredibly painful, and that's subtle judgment. Sometimes when people hear about estrangement, their mind immediately goes to, well, what must you have done? Or there are always two sides. People don't just cut off their family for no reason. Are you sure you're not being too harsh? This kind of response puts the estranged person straight into the position of defence. Instead of feeling supported, they feel like they're being investigated, like they have to prove their pain was serious enough, like they need to present evidence to justify protecting themselves. And for many people, this mirrors the exact dynamic they were trying to escape, not being believed, being blamed, being made responsible for someone else's behaviour. Estrangement is rarely a simple story, but when someone chooses distance, it is usually after a long period of trying to make things work. What they need in that moment is not a courtroom, they need compassion. Another response to be careful with is comparing the situation to your own family experience. Even if your relationships were difficult, even if you chose to handle things differently, that is your story. The person in front of you has their own history, and you don't know the full picture unless they choose to share it. You don't know what happened behind closed doors. You don't know how long they tried to make it work. And your different experience does not cancel out theirs. So what can you say instead? You might say, it sounds like this has been really painful. That's a powerful sentence. It doesn't require you to fully understand. It doesn't force false agreement. It simply offers trust. And trust is often the very thing someone hurt within a family system struggles to find. You could also say, I trust that you know what's best for you. Estrangement decisions are questioned constantly by relatives, friends, and even professionals sometimes. So when you offer confidence in someone's judgment, you are giving them something genuinely rare and precious. No comparison, no analysis, just presence. So let's talk about the forgiveness conversation, because this is another place where well-intentioned people often get it wrong. It can sound like, you should just try to forgive them. Maybe they've changed. Why not give them another chance? You'll feel better if you reach out. These comments usually come from a kind place. There's a strong belief in our culture that forgiveness and reconciliation are the end goal of healing. And for some people in some situations, that might be true, but it isn't true for everyone. And when you push that idea on someone else, it can feel less like support and more like pressure. Forgiveness is deeply personal. It's not a switch someone either flips or fails to flip. And something really important to understand is this. Forgiveness and contact are not the same thing. A person can find peace about their family situation without ever going back into a relationship that hurt them. And in fact, for many people, distance is exactly what makes the healing possible. So when you say, They might have changed, why not give them a chance? You're also making a very big assumption. You're forming an opinion about a relationship you haven't lived. The person in front of you knows far more about that dynamic than you ever will. So what can you say instead? Start by asking. Literally ask, do you want my thoughts on this, or would it be more helpful if I just listened? That question alone can change everything. It gives them control, it shows respect, it recognises that they may not be looking for advice, they may just need to be heard. We could also say, healing looks different for everyone. What does healing look like for you right now? Or simply, how can I support you? Because support isn't one fixed thing. Sometimes they need to talk, sometimes they need to have space, sometimes they need help with something completely unrelated. The key is this: ask rather than assume. Now I want to talk about the guilt category, because this is often the one that does the most lasting damage. It can sound like, you'll regret this when they're gone. You'll wish you'd spent more time with them. How could you do this to your own family? They need you. These kinds of statements try to use fear about a future loss to override a decision someone has made to protect themselves in the present. And even when they come from love, they can feel incredibly cruel, because here's the reality. People who are estranged have already thought about this over and over again. The fear of the future regret is one of the deepest psychological struggles in estrangement. Many people lie awake at night imagining every possible scenario. They carry guilt, doubt, grief, sometimes all at once. So when someone says you'll regret it, it doesn't feel like helpful advice. It feels like salt in a wound that is already wide open. There's also something important hidden in the phrase, they need you. It suggests that the estranged person's needs matter less, that their responsibility is to show up for someone else more important than their right to feel safe. And for people who have lived through manipulation, control, or repeated boundary violations, that message can feel painfully familiar. So what could you say instead? Sometimes the most supportive response is very simple. I'm here whenever you need to talk. No pressure, no agenda, just presence. You might say, I trust that you're making the choices that are right for your well-being. And perhaps the most powerful words of all are simply, I believe you. For someone who has spent years having their reality questioned or dismissed, those 3 words can mean everything. There's one more group of comments I want to talk about, because they come up all the time and they can be incredibly destructive. Things like, well, they must have done something right. Look how well you turned out. You need to stop living in the past. Could have been worse. At least they kept a roof over your head. These comments sound like perspective, but what they actually do is pull attention away from the person's pain and move it back toward defending the family. They ask someone to be grateful for the basics, as if food and shelter somehow cancel out cruelty, fear, shame, and trauma. They treat the past like it's something a person can simply decide to be over and forgotten, and that's not how people work. When someone has been hurt in a family system, that hurt doesn't just live in memory, it can live in the body, in the nervous system, in the way they move through relationships and trust and safety. So being told just to move on often says more about the other person's discomfort than it does about the person who is hurting. And honestly, if you don't know what to say, that's okay. You can be honest about that and say, I don't really know what to say, but I'm glad you told me. That is so much better than forcing advice or reaching for a cliche. And really, that's the bigger point in all of this. When someone tells you they're estranged, your job is not to fix it, not to judge it, not to play devil's advocate, not to push them toward forgiveness or reconciliation. Your job is to be present, to trust that they know their own life, and to ask what they need instead of assuming. And I know firsthand what makes estrangement even harder isn't just the loss itself, it's feeling like you have to constantly justify it to other people, because estrangement is a kind of grief that most people never recognise for what it is. There's no funeral, there's no sympathy cards, no public language for loss. Just a person carrying something enormous and invisible while the world carries on as if nothing has happened. So when you respond with warmth, curiosity and no judgment, you become something incredibly valuable. You become safe. And for someone living with estrangement, safety is everything. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this video, it's this. Before you say anything, pause and ask yourself, Am I saying this because it will help them or because it helps me feel more comfortable with what they're going through? That one pause can change everything. And if something in this video resonated with you, whether it's because you're living with this experience yourself or because you want to show up better for someone who is, I really encourage you to stay connected here and subscribe. And if you know someone who might need this video, consider sharing it with them. Sometimes having a language for experience can make people feel a little less alone.